He's got Congress members throughout the country. He's got mayors throughout the country. Well, he spent about $110 million last cycle alone in 2018 supporting House candidates, 24 of whom won. You've got 24 members of Congress getting $110 million. That's, some of them are getting $2 million, some of them are getting $4 million. And then you have that person come to you a year later and say, boy, I'd really love it if you could help me out. It's hard for them to say no, right? Then you've got mayors. You might be surprised to see how many mayors he's getting throughout the country. Well, he's got a philanthropy that gives out grants for urban programs. If your city is struggling and you want to get some sort of big grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies, that puts you in a tough spot. Then he's got nonprofits and charities. When Bloomberg ran for mayor in New York City, he tried to get himself a third term, which was at that time not really allowed in New York because the voters had a term limits referendum. Well, Bloomberg engineered a backroom deal, and amazingly, a lot of the big nonprofits in the city supported him on that. Why? We later found out that he'd given them millions of dollars. So that money goes to lots of different places beyond just merely TV commercials.
And explain what you mean. For example, for people outside of New York City, for people to understand, I mean, it was Mayor Mike Bloomberg himself who also supported term limits. Explain what the policy was in the city and how he ended up flipping it and going for a third term with, as you said, these good government groups who were absolutely opposed to a third term. It's not that he thought he could get them to say, we support this, but his strategy of neutralizing critics using money.
Right. So 2 points. On term limits in particular, this was fascinating. The voters of New York had said, we don't want our mayors to have more than 2 terms or be able to even run for it. There was a voter referendum. This was on the books. Bloomberg decides towards the very end of his second term that he'd like to be mayor again. They come up with a rationale, which is that, the city's been recovering from hard times. This was right around the time of, the Great Recession, if you will, kind of the housing crash, 2009. And they come up with this rationale that we need his economic expertise so badly that he needs to run again. Of course, later it's revealed by some of his allies, years later, that this was just an excuse to come up with some way for him to stay in office because he really wanted to do the job. So what does Bloomberg do? It's not just that he gave money to groups to kind of not make a big fuss, although he did. He also was able to use his status as a billionaire to go to the billionaire publishers of the big newspapers in New York City. So you got the Daily News, you got the New York Post, you've got the New York Times, all run by these very wealthy families. They rarely agree on anything, these newspapers, these editorial pages in particular. But they all met with Bloomberg, decided to sign on to this plan for him to go for a third term, all put out editorials kind of in unison and lockstep saying this is a great idea for the city. And that was a big part of that, developing and sort of laying the groundwork for the support for Bloomberg to do that. To your other point about him getting typical critics or potential critics to be silent on stuff, he changes his Republican voter registration to being an independent in the middle of his mayoralty. And you would think at that point, okay, the state Republican Party is now free to attack him for the rest of his term because he's not a Republican anymore. But they never did. And people were curious, why is that? Well, then we learned that he gave a record $1 million to the Republican State Senate Fund to kind of, not say too much. So the money works in all these different ways.